Something happens to overthinking at night. It deepens, quickens, and takes on a shape the daylight never shows. It was always there. When the world outside goes quiet, the mind doesn't follow. The low-level noise of the day, movement, conversation, the ambient hum of screens, acts as a sensory gate, suppressing the inner voice automatically without you're ever asking it to. Remove that gate and the voice that was always running beneath everything finally has the room entirely to itself. And it doesn't stay quiet. There is a brain network that becomes most active not when you are focused, but precisely when you aren't, when you drift, lie still, wait for nothing. Neuroscientists call it the default mode network, and at night, with nothing pulling attention outward, it turns completely inward. That's where the night begins. The default mode network doesn't process neutral material, it processes you, your memories, your social standing, the events you haven't finished making sense of yet. It is the self-referential circuit of the brain, and lying still in the dark is structurally its most ideal working condition. If this feels familiar, like and subscribe. The inner voice isn't a figure of speech. When you lie in the dark hearing yourself think, rehearsing a conversation, replaying a decision, revisiting a moment from earlier in the day, the brain regions associated with actual spoken language are measurably active. Broca's area, portions of the motor cortex responsible for articulation, the pathways that carry language from production to comprehension. All of them engaged, not by speech, but by the silent internal version of it. Researchers have a word for this: subvocalization, the muted muscular and neural rehearsal of language that occurs when the voice runs without sound. It is not a metaphor for thought. In a documented and replicable sense, it is the same machinery, which means the voice you hear at 2 a.m. turning over something that happened at noon is not a secondary copy of language. It is language running without a listener, which changes what it means to lie awake, talking to yourself in the dark. Overthinking at night doesn't reach randomly into what the day contained. It gravitates with something close to precision toward the events that weren't finished, conversations that ended before anything resolved, decisions still hanging open, moments where something important was left unsaid or said with the wrong word or received in a way that hasn't yet been fully accounted for. Psychologists have known since the 1920s through the work of researcher Bluma Zygarnik, who first documented it while observing waiters in a Berlin cafe, that the mind holds onto incomplete experiences with measurably greater persistence than completed ones. She noticed that waiters could recall unpaid orders in remarkable detail, but forgot settled bills almost immediately. The mind, it turned out, treats unfinished business as an open file, one it returns to involuntarily until some form of closure arrives. At night, with the day's tasks no longer competing for attention, every open file surfaces at once. Have you ever noticed which moments the night keeps bringing you back to? In some people, the pace of inner speech accelerates in the hours before sleep. What moves at a manageable rhythm during the afternoon becomes something faster and less organized in the dark, thoughts arriving before the previous one has fully formed, less like narration and more like interruption. Researchers who study the phenomenology of inner speech note that thought speed and emotional arousal are tightly coupled. As the feeling running beneath a thought intensifies, the interval between thoughts contracts. The mind doesn't slow down when the body does. In many people, it does the opposite. The loop doesn't simply persist into the night. It picks up pace, not louder in volume, louder in presence. Most people believe they are still thinking through a problem long after they have stopped thinking and started circling. The loop closes without any signal, no internal notification, no recognition that this same sequence of thoughts has already arrived here twice before and found nothing. Waiting. Research in metacognition, the study of how accurately people observe their own mental processes, finds that individuals consistently overestimate their ability to detect when thinking has become repetitive. There is a monitoring system in the mind that is supposed to catch exactly this, but at night, under emotional load, that monitor becomes part of the loop itself. You can travel deep inside a thought spiral before it becomes visible as one, by which point, of course, you are already inside it. And that delay is not a small thing. The psychologist Russell Hurlburt spent decades catching inner experience in the act, interrupting people at random moments with a small beeping device, then asking them to describe as precisely as possible what had been occurring in their mind at the exact instant of the beep. What he found challenged nearly every assumption most people carry about the nature of their own inner life. Experience is not a continuous, well-formed stream of sentences. It arrives in pieces, partial images that dissolve before completing, emotional tones with no words attached to them, the edge of a thought that never quite resolves into language. Hurlburt called some of what he found unsymbolized thinking, a sense of knowing something, intending something, processing something without any accompanying verbal form. What we confidently call the inner voice is, in many of its actual moments, more like an impression of a voice, something reaching toward language without always arriving there. At night, when those fragments have nothing competing with them, they gather. They take on shape, weight, and insistence that they may never carry in the ordinary noise of the day. Something about that description is more accurate than the version most of us hold of ourselves. The emotional quality of thought shifts as the night deepens, and this is not a matter of mood, it is a matter of biology moving through a scheduled phase. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, follows a carefully timed daily rhythm, and in the late evening, its suppression of the brain's emotional regulation systems is incomplete. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region that normally softens the weight of recalled events by placing them inside a larger context, operates with diminished influence. After dark, studies consistently find that the same event a person processed as a minor irritation at 4 in the afternoon can arrive at midnight, carrying a noticeably different quality, heavier, more threatening, more final sounding than the actual facts would warrant. It isn't pessimism, isn't weakness. It is the brain at a particular point in its daily chemistry, and it does this in nearly everyone every night reliably and on schedule. The night is not a neutral place to think, and the voice that speaks in that non-neutral dark is not a single, unified thing. What feels like one internal narrator, your voice, your concerns, your thoughts arriving in some kind of sequence, is actually several overlapping processes running in parallel. One drawing from episodic memory, one simulating likely futures, one monitoring for unresolved social threat, one scanning for errors and open questions that still require attention. Before sleep is permitted, the experience of lying awake while thoughts arrive faster than rest can interrupt them is the experience of those systems failing to hand off cleanly, not broken, not disordered, running, still working the unfinished problem the day left open on its way out the door. There is a particular kind of night thought that doesn't feel like thinking at all, feels like watching. A scene replays, something said at a table or in a hallway or through a screen, and the mind runs it again and again, not to extract something new from it, but because it cannot yet put it down. You are not choosing this. The scene arrives and the mind goes with it, and somewhere in the middle of the third or fourth pass through the same 15 seconds, you become aware that you have already been here, and that awareness changes. Nothing at all. This is one of the night's most common experiences, and it is not random. Psychologists draw a careful line between two activities that can feel nearly identical in the dark: rumination and reflection. Reflection moves, turns an experience over, finds something it hadn't noticed before, arrives somewhere, a conclusion, a shift, a small act of understanding. Rumination doesn't move. It is defined in clinical terms as repetitive, passive, self-focused attention to distress, the mind returning to the same material, not to process it but to circle it, the loop that runs at midnight replaying. A conversation is not problem-solving that hasn't found the answer yet, is a different kind of cognitive activity entirely, and it operates according to its own rules, separate from reflection's purpose. The brain doesn't always know the difference. When the mind replays a moment of social conflict, an argument, a slight misreading, a silence that landed wrong, the amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection structure, treats the replay as a live event, not a memory of a threat. A threat, the same structure that activates in the presence of physical danger activates in the presence of social danger, and it does not clearly distinguish between something happening now and something happening in the mind's reconstruction of 2 days ago, which means the loop doesn't just feel emotionally real. Neurologically, in the language the body uses to organize its resources, it is real, and the amygdala stays partially active throughout the replay, maintaining a low physiological arousal that makes disengagement measurably harder with each pass. You are not just remembering, you are partly re-experiencing. Do you ever notice which conversations come back and which ones don't? Memory retrieval is not like reading a file. When a memory is recalled, it is reconstructed, assembled from stored fragments, filled in, shaped by the emotional state of the person recalling it. And the brain regions responsible for that reconstruction overlap substantially with the regions that were active during the original experience. Neuroimaging research finds that vividly recalling an emotional event engages not only the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, but also the sensory and motor cortices associated with the modalities present in the original scene. The voice you hear, the posture of the person across from you, the temperature of the room, faintly. Memory is not played back. In the most concrete sense, it is replayed, and in the replaying, it is also partially relived. That is what the night does with it. The mind does not simply retrieve what happened. It runs what might happen next. Deep inside the machinery of the overthinking night, the brain is doing something closer to simulation than memory, constructing possible futures, possible responses, possible outcomes, and running them through the inner voice to test their plausibility. This is sometimes called mental time travel, the capacity, unique and remarkable in its complexity, to lift cognition out of the present moment and set it down in times that have not arrived or in versions of the past that might have gone differently. Night, without the present moment demanding anything, this capacity runs freely. The mind rehearses the conversation you will have tomorrow, then the one from last week that still hasn't resolved, then a version of tomorrow's conversation that incorporates everything the one from last week taught you, and then begins again from a slightly different starting point. It is, in a quiet way, a remarkable cognitive capability. At 1 a.m., it is also exhausting. Something that is trying to help can also prevent rest. The part of the brain most active during this kind of self-referential nighttime replay is not the amygdala alone or the hippocampus working through episodic material. It is the medial prefrontal cortex, a region that sits at the intersection of self-knowledge, social reasoning, and the modeling of other minds. When you lie awake running a conversation through your head, you are not running only your own side of it. You are constructing the other person, their tone, their likely interpretation, the expression you imagined on their face. The medial prefrontal cortex is the structure most responsible for this, and at night, with no external social information arriving to redirect it, it generates that construction from memory, habit, and emotional bias. The version of the other person in the nighttime loop is always, to some degree, a portrait painted in your own cognitive colors, which means the argument is never quite with the person who was actually there. And sometimes the voice in the loop is recognizably theirs. The psychologist Charles Ferneyhoff, who has spent years studying the inner voice in both typical development and clinical conditions, has documented something that many people recognize immediately when they encounter it, the inner critic that speaks at night often does not sound entirely like oneself. It carries the cadence, the phrasing, the particular weight of a real person, sometimes a parent, sometimes a colleague, sometimes someone whose opinion mattered once and has never fully let go. Ferneyhof's work on inner speech suggests that the internal voice is not originally private. It develops through internalized dialogue, through years of conversation, criticism, comfort, and instruction from voices outside the self, and those voices are never fully separated from the one that eventually sounds like you. The inner critic at midnight is, in part, an archive of other people's reactions, speaking in the language you learned to use when you were learning what you were. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Thought loops at night progressively narrow the range of what the mind can access. This is one of their quieter costs. When cognitive tunneling occurs, the gradual constriction of available associative pathways under emotional load, the mind isn't just stuck on one topic, it becomes less able to reach the adjacent ones that might naturally resolve or reframe it. The same small cluster of connected memories, predictions, and self-assessments loops through available channels, while the broader network of associations that might offer a different angle grows functionally quieter. What begins as returning to a single difficult moment becomes, over time, a space in which very few exits are visible. Not because the exits aren't there, because the tunneling process has temporarily made them harder to find. The night makes that narrowing feel like certainty. Counterfactual thinking, the mind's rehearsal of alternatives that didn't happen, of things that could have gone differently, is measurably more active in the hours after 10 in the evening. The structure of counterfactual thought at night is distinctly asymmetric. The mind generates far more upward counterfactuals, versions of events that would have turned out better than they did, than downward ones. What I should have said, the path I didn't take, the moment I could have changed if I had only moved one second differently. Research in this area consistently finds that this asymmetry, while painful in the short term, is part of how the mind's learning system attempts to extract guidance for future behavior. The loop, asking what I should have said, is, in its deep structural logic, a system trying to improve. The problem is not the intention. The problem is that at night, with no action available, the improvement loop runs without anywhere to direct what it finds. And so it circles. And so it circles again. At some point in the night, you notice you are inside something. Not a thought, a structure. The same sequence arriving again with the same emotional weight, the same unresolved ending, the same momentary sense that this time it might go somewhere, and then the return to the beginning, so seamless that you almost didn't notice the join. It doesn't feel like choosing to think about it again. It feels more like finding yourself already thinking about it, already halfway through the loop before the part of you that watches could say anything at all. There is an architecture to this, and it is stranger than it first appears. Intrusive thoughts, thoughts that arrive uninvited, that the mind did not consciously direct, are not a symptom of a disordered mind. They are a feature of every mind in every person on virtually every night. Research in clinical psychology has found that the thought content reported by people diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder is not categorically different from the thought content reported by people with no diagnosis at all. The same themes appear: doubt, harm, embarrassment, inadequacy, unresolved, conflict. What differs is not what arrives, but what the mind does next. How much significance it assigns to the arrival, how long it holds on, how urgently it attempts to resolve what may not be resolvable. The loop is not evidence of something wrong with the thinker. It is evidence of the normal mind under conditions it was not fully designed for. Darkness and stillness happen to be exactly those conditions. The anterior cingulate cortex sits at one of the most consequential intersections in the human brain, the point where emotional processing meets error detection, where the sense of wrongness meets the search for correction. It fires when something is unfinished, when a question has been asked and not answered, when a pattern is incomplete, when a goal has been registered but not reached. At night, when unresolved emotional material surfaces without any available action to address it, the anterior cingulate produces something that feels, from the inside, like urgency, a low-level, persistent signal that something still requires attention. It is not telling you that the situation is dangerous. It is telling you that the file is still open, but in the dark, with nothing else to receive that signal, the mind experiences it as pressure. And pressure, in the absence of an exit, becomes a loop. The urgency is real. The resolution it's pointing toward may not exist. Yet, what makes the loop self-sustaining is something that nighttime reliably weakens. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain most responsible for executive control, for the deliberate regulation of attention, for the ability to decide that a thought has run its course and redirect to something else, requires a level of metabolic energy it doesn't fully have late at night. Its inhibitory function, the capacity to stand at the threshold of a recurring thought and decline to engage it, diminishes as the hour deepens. This is not a failure of character or willpower. It is a scheduled biological reduction in the neural infrastructure that executive suppression depends on. The night structurally compromises the one system best equipped to interrupt the loop, and then the loop runs, which is worth knowing the next time it runs. Have you ever tried to stop thinking about something and found that trying made it worse? That is one of the night's most precise ironies. What actually starts the loop is rarely the full weight of the thing being thought about. Most nighttime rumination cycles are not triggered by a complete memory surfacing intact. They are triggered by fragments, single word with emotional residue attached to it, a flash of an image, the recalled tone of a voice without any of its content, the texture of a feeling without a clear origin. These fragments are enough. The associative architecture of memory is built for completion. The mind will construct context around a fragment automatically, filling in what the fragment implies, and in the filling in, the broader memory arrives. What arrived first was almost nothing. What follows it is everything the nothing was connected to. And at night, in the silence, that architecture runs without interruption. A single word can open an entire room. What happens inside a developed loop is something that researchers who study inner speech find consistently surprising. The mind doesn't simply repeat the original material. It argues, constructs an absent person's likely response and then responds to that response, cross-examines its own reasoning, finds weaknesses, addresses them, finds new weaknesses. The loop generates a dialogue even in the complete absence of another person, a simulated conversation with someone who cannot actually push back, which means the simulation can be made to go wherever the emotional current is running. The other person in the loop is always just articulate, enough to be worth arguing with and never quite reasonable enough to be satisfying to have argued with. The conversation that exists only in your mind at 3 a.m. is one you are writing both sides of, and the side you keep losing to is the one you wrote yourself. Something about that is almost funny when it isn't keeping you awake. Not everyone enters the loop through language. For a portion of people, the nighttime spiral begins not in the inner voice but in the body. Tightening in the chest, a shift in the quality of the breath, a warmth moving through the face, a restlessness that begins in the legs and works upward. The inner voice arrives second to narrate what the body has already registered. Researchers studying the relationship between somatic markers and cognitive content find that the sequence often runs in this direction: body first, language second, though the conscious experience typically presents it the other way around. The thought seems to have caused the tension, but the tension was already there below the threshold of attention, waiting for the inner voice to arrive and name it. What the voice provides in these cases is not the origin of the loop. It is the story the loop tells about its own origin. The body has already been in the loop for some time before you know it. There is one more structural element that keeps the night spiral running, and it is perhaps the most quietly effective of all. Anxiety maintains the loop not through force but through chemistry. Even mild ambient anxiety, the kind that doesn't announce itself as fear, that registers only as a faint restlessness or an inability to settle, keeps the memory retrieval gates partially open. It elevates the accessibility of emotionally charged material while simultaneously reducing the resources available for cognitive control. This is the loop's most elegant mechanism. The emotion maintaining the loop is produced by the loop, which keeps the loop running, which maintains the emotion, not a malfunction, a closed system operating exactly as its components dictate, in conditions, darkness, stillness, solitude, a loosened prefrontal grip, that happen to be the conditions every night reliably provides. The loop doesn't need to be fed from outside. It carries its own fuel. Sleep is not a pause. It is not the mind going dark, the body waiting for morning, a blank space between one day and the next. Sleep is the most metabolically active, neurologically complex, and cognitively consequential period in the human day, and overthinking does not simply delay it. Moves through it, reshaping what it was designed to do, altering what gets kept from the day and what gets quietly released. The cost of a night spent looping is not only the missing hours of rest. It is what those hours were supposed to accomplish and didn't. What gets interrupted first is the process of arrival itself. The brain does not switch from waking to sleep the way a light switches off. It descends through stages of progressively loosening attention, increasing neural synchrony, deepening physiological calm, and that descent requires a specific condition the loop actively prevents: the reduction of cognitive arousal. Sleep researchers distinguish carefully between physical tiredness and cognitive arousal, and their interaction is not what most people expect. The body can be exhausted and the mind can still be running. Physiological fatigue and mental quietude are separate systems, and the second does not reliably follow the first. A person can lie still, eyes closed, limbs heavy, while the inner voice continues its full operation, generating scenarios, retrieving memories, monitoring threats, and that activity regardless of how tired the body beneath it is, measurably delays sleep onset. Cognitive arousal, not physical wakefulness, is the primary obstacle between overthinking and sleep. The tired mind and the quiet mind are not the same thing. What the loop costs most concretely is a specific and irreplaceable phase of sleep. Slow-wave sleep, sometimes called deep sleep or stage 3. Non-REM is the phase of lowest arousal, longest sleep spindles, and highest production of the slow, synchronized brain waves that give it its name. It is the phase in which the body repairs tissue, consolidates procedural learning, and carries out the hormonal maintenance that the waking day continuously defers. And it is the phase most directly suppressed by high pre-sleep cognitive arousal. Studies measuring sleep architecture in people who report significant nighttime rumination find consistent reductions in the duration and quality of slow-wave sleep, not only on individual nights but as a pattern across time. The loop doesn't take a little from every phase equally, takes disproportionately from the deepest one. The part that is hardest to replace is the part most reduced. Something else happens in that deep phase, something whose loss is stranger and more consequential than most people know about. The brain is surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, and during slow-wave sleep, a recently discovered system called the glymphatic network uses that fluid to flush the spaces between neurons, clearing the metabolic byproducts that accumulate during waking cognition, including a protein called amyloid beta that is associated at elevated concentrations with neurodegeneration. This clearance process is not evenly distributed across the sleep cycle. It operates most efficiently during slow wave Sleep, when neurons contract slightly, opening the interstitial spaces that allow fluid to move through. The discovery of the glymphatic system is recent enough, published in Science in 2013, that its full implications are still being mapped. But what is already clear is that the brain's own maintenance system, its nightly cleaning process, is directly dependent on the deepest phase of sleep that overthinking most reliably shortens. The mind that won't stop is also the mind that cleans itself less. Later in the night, when the architecture shifts toward the other critical phase, a different kind of loss begins. REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, the phase most associated with vivid dreaming, is not the passive theater it was once thought to be. It is, among other things, an emotional processing laboratory, a phase during which the brain reactivates the emotional content of recent experience while simultaneously reducing the concentration of norepinephrine, the neurochemical most associated with threat arousal. The neuroscientist Matthew Walker, whose research at the University of California, Berkeley, has extensively mapped the relationship between sleep and emotional memory, describes this as a kind of overnight therapy, the brain replaying difficult material in a neurochemical environment that allows its emotional charge to be reduced. REM sleep in this model doesn't just store emotional memory, it metabolizes it, strips the sharp edge from what happened so that the memory remains available without carrying its original weight. Chronic overthinking, which disrupts the sleep architecture that delivers adequate REM, interferes with this process. The emotional content doesn't get metabolized. It gets stored intact, still sharp, still weighted, available for the next night's loop to find it exactly as it left it, which means the unresolved feeling tonight may be waiting exactly where it was left tomorrow night at the same hour. The chemistry of the night is already moving in the direction of overthinking before the loop begins. Cortisol, the adrenal hormone most associated with the stress response, follows a daily curve that troughs in the early hours of sleep and rises sharply toward morning. But in people who ruminate significantly before sleep, that trough is compromised. Elevated cognitive arousal sustains cortisol at levels above the baseline the brain requires for melatonin production to proceed efficiently. Melatonin, the hormone most directly responsible for signaling the body's transition into sleep, is not simply a sleep-inducing chemical. It is a timing signal, the brain's internal announcement that darkness has arrived and the transition should begin. When cortisol suppresses its production, the signal is weakened. The transition is delayed, and the delay is not simply a matter of lying awake longer, it is a displacement of the entire sleep cycle that follows, compressing the later stages and reducing the total architecture the night was supposed to deliver. The loop doesn't only fill the night, it shortens it. Sleep that is curtailed or architecturally disrupted does something the following day that has a particular cruelty to it. REM deprivation, insufficient time in the emotional processing phase, measurably increases emotional reactivity the next day. The amygdala becomes more responsive to negatively valost stimuli, while the prefrontal cortex's regulatory influence over it decreases. Small frustrations land harder. Ambiguous social signals read as threatening more readily. The threshold for the kind of emotional event that becomes that night's rumination. Material drops. The person who lay awake overthinking last night is more likely today to experience something worth overthinking about. Tonight, the cycle does not simply repeat. It generates the conditions for its own continuation, each disrupted night making the next night's disruptions slightly more available, slightly easier to arrive at, slightly harder to interrupt. The loop teaches itself forward. And then there is the long account, the one that accumulates not over nights but over months and years of chronically disrupted sleep. The hippocampus, the brain structure most central to the formation and retrieval of episodic memory, is exquisitely sensitive to the effects of chronically elevated cortisol. Sustained high cortisol levels, the kind produced by chronic stress, chronic rumination, chronic sleep disruption, are associated with measurable reductions in hippocampal volume over time. Research imaging studies have documented this relationship across multiple populations and conditions. The hippocampus is not simply a storage site. It is the structure responsible for placing memories in context, for grounding them in time and sequence, for the cognitive sense that the past is past and the present is present, that what happened then is distinct from what is happening now. Hippocampus operating under chronic cortisol exposure becomes less reliable at precisely this function, the contextual separation of memory from current experience, which may partially explain why, in someone who has spent months lying awake in loops, the events being replayed can feel as immediate and unresolved as the moment they occurred. The structure that would tell you it's over is the one the loop is gradually wearing down. Memory is not a recording. It has never been. Not in the way most people carry it as a reliable archive of what actually happened, stored once and retrieved unchanged. The past sitting somewhere inside the brain like a photograph in a drawer. Memory is a reconstruction. Every time it is accessed, it is reassembled from component parts shaped by the current emotional state of the person, doing the remembering and then stored again in that newly shaped form, which means that every night spent turning a memory over, replaying it, re-examining it, rehearsing what it means, is not a night of passively revisiting the past. It is a night of editing it, of writing a slightly different version of what happened and filing that version in the place where the original used to be. The loop doesn't just revisit the past, quietly revises it. This is called reconsolidation, the process by which a memory, once retrieved, becomes temporarily unstable and is then restored in a modified form. Neuroscientists have documented reconsolidation in animal models and in human subjects across a range of experimental conditions, and the finding is consistent. Retrieval is not a read-only process. It is a read and rewrite process. The emotional tone present during retrieval, the anxiety, the shame, the low-grade dread running beneath. The nighttime loop is incorporated into the restored version of the memory. A memory retrieved in a state of distress is stored, afterward, as a slightly more distressing memory than it was before it was retrieved. Not because anything about the original event changed, because the experience of remembering it in that emotional condition became part of the memory itself. Each pass through the loop leaves a residue. The night is not a neutral emotional environment, and this is not a matter of perception or attitude. It is a matter of neural asymmetry that operates beneath conscious experience and shapes it from below. The negativity bias, the well-documented tendency of the human brain to weight negative information more heavily than equivalent positive information, does not run at a constant level across the day. It intensifies in the evening. Studies examining emotional valence in thought content across different times of day find that the same ambiguous event, a message, unreturned, a comment whose meaning was unclear, an expression that could have been read several ways, is more likely to be interpreted negatively after dark than it would be at midday. The encoding of emotional memory is also affected. Events that enter memory in the late evening are tagged with higher emotional intensity than events encoded during the day. The night amplifies what is already there, and the loop running inside that amplification does its work in conditions tilted systematically toward wait. The dark does not invent the feeling, turns up its volume. What the loop returns to most reliably, across individuals, across cultures, across the different contents of different lives, are the memories where shame was present, not just embarrassment, which is social and surface level, and fades. Shame, the deeper assessment that the self, not just the action, was insufficient. Research examining the emotional content of nighttime rumination finds shame-related memories occupying a disproportionate share of the loop's material, more so than fear-based memories, more so than grief, more so than anger. Shame is prioritized because it carries unresolved social information. It is the mind's signal that something about the self's presentation, its adequacy, its standing in the group, remains uncertain, and uncertainty, as the anterior cingulate has already been noted to insist, is a file that stays open. Shame-related material at night is not simply emotionally heavy. It is flagged as unfinished. And unfinished files the mind returns to. The night keeps the accounts it hasn't closed. At the edge of sleep, when the mind has not quite crossed from waking into dreaming, something strange happens to the relationship between what is remembered and what is imagined. The hypnagogic state, the threshold condition of sleep onset, is characterized by a loosening of the brain's reality monitoring function, the system that ordinarily maintains the distinction between recalled experience and generated imagery. In this state, the vivid mental rehearsal of a feared scenario, a confrontation imagined in detail, a failure pictured frame by frame, can acquire the phenomenological texture of a memory rather than a projection. The brain cannot fully verify at that threshold whether something was experienced or constructed, and material that has been rehearsed many times, worried over repeatedly, imagined in detail across many nights, begins to carry a familiarity that the memory system associates with having happened. This is not delusion. It is a normal feature of a normal mind at a specific and vulnerable transitional point. But it means that a worry rehearsed enough times at the edge of sleep can begin to feel, in a quiet way, like something that already occurred. What is feared long enough starts to feel like memory. Does any of that sound familiar? A worry that has lived in you so long feels less like a thought about the future and more like something you're already carrying. Repetition does something else to the emotional memory system that is less visible but more lasting. Each return to a difficult thought, each loop through the same self-critical sequence, strengthens the associative connections between the self and the negative material the thought contains. Memory is organized associatively. Concepts, emotions, and self-assessments that are frequently retrieved together become more strongly linked over time, their connections thickened by repetition. The nighttime loop that returns again and again to a moment of failure is not simply revisiting that moment. It is, through repetition, strengthening the neural pathway that connects the memory of failure to the felt sense of the self. The self and the failure become more associated, not because the failure was larger than it was, but because the mind visited that connection so many times that the path between them grew wide and fast and easy to travel. The loop doesn't just find the self-critical thought. Over time, it builds the road to it. Emotion regulation, the capacity to modulate the intensity and duration of emotional responses, depends heavily on a region called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This structure sits at the convergence of rational evaluation and emotional experience, and its primary function in the context of difficult memory is something like placing the event inside a larger frame. This happened and it means this much, and here is the context that prevents it from meaning everything. At night, ventromedial prefrontal activity is reduced. Its moderating influence over the emotional system weakens. This is why the nighttime version of a remembered event tends to arrive without the contextual cushioning the daytime version carries, stripped of the surrounding facts and competing considerations that soften its edges during waking hours. The full force of the emotional content arrives with diminished access to the structure that would normally hold some of it back. The event doesn't become more important at night. It becomes less padded. Night removes the cushion around what the mind carries. The morning after a night of significant rumination carries a particular quality that is not simply fatigue. People who ruminate heavily before sleep consistently report what researchers describe as blunted positive affect the following day, a flattening of the ordinary responsiveness to pleasure, interest, and reward that characterizes emotional health. This is distinct from sadness or low mood in its clinical sense. It is more like a muting, the small satisfactions that ordinarily register. Cup of something warm, a piece of music, a moment of unexpected ease, arrive with less signal strength than they would after an uninterrupted night. The brain's reward circuitry running on disrupted sleep architecture, and a neurochemical landscape altered by hours of nocturnal arousal produces reward responses at a lower amplitude. What should feel like enough feels slightly less than enough. What should brighten the morning arrives slightly dimmed. The night spent looping takes something from the day that follows it, and the inner voice, moving through its loop, does not simply orbit the present and the recent past, travels. One of the more quietly remarkable features of nighttime rumination, documented in diary studies, experience, sampling research, and clinical accounts, is the regularity with which the loop moves between temporal locations, past and future, regret and anticipation, what went wrong and what might go wrong, visited in rapid, nearly seamless alternation. The mind at 2 a.m. is rarely in 2 a.m. It is somewhere in the last 5 years, or somewhere in the next 6 months, or in a version of tomorrow that hasn't arrived and may never arrive in. The form being rehearsed. This temporal mobility, the capacity to move consciousness backward and forward in time within the same thought cycle, is one of the most cognitively sophisticated things the human mind does. It is also, at night, one of the most disorienting. The person lying still in the dark is present in that room only in the loosest sense. Everywhere else in the loop, they are somewhere else entirely, carried by a voice that doesn't require the present moment to have anything to say. The night holds still. The mind inside it does not. There is a question underneath the loop that the loop never quite asks directly. Not what happened or what should have been said or what might come next. Something quieter than that and older. A question that has been running longer than any single night, longer than any particular event the mind keeps returning to. It moves beneath the specific content of the worry, like a current beneath surface water, felt more than seen, shaping everything that moves above it without ever quite surfacing itself. The question is something like, who am I? And is that enough? The inner voice is not simply a tool the self uses to think. It is, in a meaningful and measurable sense, part of how the self is built. Psychologists and narrative theorists who study identity development describe what they call the narrative self, the ongoing, internally generated story a person tells about who they are, where they came from, and where they are going. This story is not written once and remembered. It is actively maintained, revised, and rehearsed, and the primary medium in which that maintenance occurs is inner speech. The voice that runs at night is not separate from identity. It is the voice doing identity's ongoing work, and at night, with no competing narrative arriving from outside, it does that work with a freedom and an intensity that the day rarely allows. The self is partly a story the night keeps rewriting. What the loop does to that story is not neutral. Night rumination characteristically operates on the self-concept through a process of amplification, taking an event that was in the context of an entire life, a small data point, and running it repeatedly through the self-evaluative system until it begins to carry the weight of something defining. A moment of social awkwardness becomes evidence of a pattern. A single decision made under pressure becomes a referendum on judgment. A comment received badly becomes a window onto something fundamental about how one is perceived. None of this is logically entailed by the event itself. But logic is not what governs the nighttime loop. Association is, repetition is, and repetition as the emotional memory system has already made clear builds roads. The more the mind returns to a moment, the more defining it becomes. Not all inner speech sounds like the person it belongs to. The psychologist Ethan Kross, whose research at the University of Michigan has extensively examined the relationship between self-talk and emotional regulation, has documented something whose implications extend well beyond its apparent simplicity. The pronoun a person uses when talking to themselves changes the emotional outcome of the conversation. When people address themselves using the first person, I feel this, I am afraid of this, I did this, they are inside the experience, narrating from within its emotional field with full access to its weight and immediacy. When they shift to using their own name, when the inner voice moves from I to the name a person was called as a child, something measurable changes. The perspective shifts. The emotional flooding reduces. The self becomes briefly an object of observation rather than the subject of experience. This distanced self-talk, as Kross calls it, is not a technique most people apply deliberately, but some people use it naturally, and those who do show measurably reduced rumination duration, faster emotional recovery, and greater clarity in decision-making under stress. The name carries a distance the pronoun doesn't. And at night, that distance is exactly what the loop forecloses. The word I keeps you inside. Your own name can let you step back. The inner critic that speaks at night is not neurologically a single voice. What feels like one persistent evaluative presence, the voice that delivers the verdict on the day's performance, that identifies what fell short, that rehearses the judgment others may have formed, is generated by multiple overlapping systems: the self-monitoring network, the social threat detection system, the evaluative processes of the medial prefrontal cortex, the associative memory structures that link current self-assessment to accumulated prior experience. These systems do not always agree. They do not always produce the same output. What arrives in consciousness as a unified inner critic is, beneath that surface unity, a negotiated composite, several processes, speaking in close enough succession that they register as one voice. This matters because it means the critic is not a single, coherent authority delivering accurate assessments. It is the loudest available output of a system with multiple competing inputs. And at night, when The quieter inputs lose ground to the louder ones, the critic sounds, more certain than it has any structural right to be. The authority the inner critic seems to carry is partly an artifact of the conditions that amplify it. What draws the night loop so reliably toward social material, toward how others perceived you, what they thought when you said that, what they would think if they knew, is a cognitive process that runs in humans with a depth and persistence found in no other species. The looking glass self, a concept originating in social psychology, describes the mind's continuous modeling of itself as seen through the imagined eyes of others, the construction of a second-person version of the self, observed from outside, assessed by external standards. This process is active during waking hours, but it is constrained by incoming social information, actual feedback, visible responses, the real behavior of real people providing data that corrects or calibrates the internal model. At night, that incoming data stops. The model runs without correction. The imagined observer, what others see, what others think, what others would say, is no longer constrained by what others actually do. And unconstrained, the imagined gaze tends, in the nighttime emotional environment, toward the harsher end of the available range. The audience the mind constructs at night is rarely a forgiving one. There is something in the body when shame-based self-talk runs at night that is not simply emotional in the way the word is usually used, is physical in a specific and documented way. People describing shame-related nighttime thought consistently report sensations of heat in the face, constriction in the chest, a heaviness that localizes somewhere between the sternum and the throat. Researchers studying the embodied dimensions of emotion find that shame, unlike many other negative emotions, activates a distinctive somatic signature, a pattern of physical sensation that appears to be consistent across individuals and cultures. The body contracts, the face heats, something that can only be described as a wish to disappear moves through the physical self at the same moment the inner voice is making its nighttime assessment. The evaluation is not experienced only in language. It is experienced in the body that carries the language, and the body's response becomes part of the memory of the thought, adding a physical layer to the record that will be there the next time the loop returns. The body remembers the verdict alongside the voice that delivered it. Among the stranger findings in the research on nighttime self-talk is this chronic night overthinking is associated in several studies not only with higher trait neuroticism, the personality dimension, most associated with emotional instability and ruminative tendencies, but also with higher verbal intelligence and greater sensitivity to linguistic nuance. The same cognitive architecture that makes a person more likely to spiral at 2 a.m. also makes them more likely to be precise, with language more attuned to the subtle freight of words, more capable of the kind of layered internal narration that the loop runs on. This is not consolation. It is simply a feature of the mind's construction. The same instrument that makes the night difficult may also be the one that makes certain things possible in the day. The two are not separate endowments. They are different expressions of the same underlying sensitivity. The night reveals what the same capacity costs and produces. When a person is alone, truly alone in the dark without distraction or company, the inner voice begins to take on functions it doesn't ordinarily carry during social hours. It fills the space where other people's voices would be. It begins generating responses to imagined interlocutors, anticipating reactions, producing the conversational texture of an exchange that is happening entirely internally. Researchers studying the phenomenology of solitude note that the inner voice expands in isolation, not just in volume but in social complexity, simulating relationships, generating the felt sense of being accompanied in the absence of any actual company. At night, alone in a room, the mind does not simply think. It populates the silence with the reconstructed presence of the people who matter most, and then, in the emotional conditions of the late-night loop, evaluates itself against what those reconstructed presences seem to see. The night is never truly empty. The mind fills it immediately, and somewhere in the middle of all this, the self-narration, the social modeling, the critic composited from competing systems, the shame sitting in the chest, the name that might provide distance but rarely arrives on its own. Something else is quietly occurring. Research into the relationship between rumination and creativity finds a correlation that surprises most people when they first encounter it. Some individuals who report high levels of nighttime overthinking also report higher rates of creative insight the following day. Not because the loop produces the insight directly, it rarely does, but because the loop keeps certain material active at a level of processing that continues into sleep, and sleep, working on material that has been extensively rehearsed, occasionally produces a reorganization that the conscious waking mind would not have reached alone. The night that felt like pure cost occasionally deposits something at the door of morning that wasn't there the night before. What felt only like circling sometimes turns out to have been something else as well. The inner voice is not housed in the mind alone. It is easy to think of it that way, as something occurring in some interior space that floats above the physical, a stream of language, moving through consciousness without touching the body that carries. But the voice has hardware. It runs on neural tissue, on electrochemical gradients, on the same biological structures that move a hand or regulate a heartbeat. And at night, when the loop is running, when the inner speech is generating scenarios, rehearsing conflicts, anticipating judgments, the body beneath it is not simply waiting. It is listening, responding, registering every word the voice produces, as though the events being described were physically present in the room. The body does not know the difference between a thought and a threat. When the nighttime loop runs at sufficient intensity, when the inner rehearsal of a confrontation reaches the kind of vividness that detailed mental simulation produces, tiny, measurable contractions occur in the muscles of the lips, tongue, and larynx. This is subvocalization, the faint muscular echo of speech that occurs during inner speech production, a residue of the motor programs the brain activates when language is being processed at depth. In quiet waking, inner speech subvocalization is minimal, often below the threshold of ordinary detection, but during intense nighttime rumination, when emotional arousal is high and the inner voice is running arguments, rehearsing phrases, finding exactly the right words for a response that will never be delivered, the muscular activity increases measurably. The body is not merely hosting the thought. At the level of the speech musculature, it is partially performing it, mouthing almost inaudibly the words the mind is generating in the dark. The conversation happening in silence is not entirely silent. What the voice says at night is enough by itself to activate the branch of the nervous system designed for emergency. The sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight architecture that evolved to mobilize the body in response to physical danger, responds to linguistic content, not only to genuine threats, but to the representation of threats in language. A sentence generated internally, describing a feared outcome with sufficient emotional charge, produces a measurable sympathetic response. Pupil dilation, increased heart rate, a shift in blood flow toward the large muscle groups, a release of adrenaline into the circulatory system. The body cannot fully distinguish between a tiger in the room and a thought about a tiger in the room because the same neural structures process both, which means the nighttime loop, rehearsing a difficult conversation or constructing a vivid scenario of failure, is activating a physiological response designed for moments requiring immediate physical action. In a body lying completely still with nowhere to direct what it has just mobilized, the alarm is going off in a room with no exits. One of the less obvious costs of that activation is its effect on temperature regulation. Sleep onset is associated with a specific and necessary drop in core body temperature, the thermoregulatory shift that signals the body's transition from wakefulness to sleep is not simply a consequence of inactivity, but an actively managed biological process in which heat is redistributed from the body's core to its periphery, allowing the core to cool. This cooling is part of the physiological cascade that enables the brain to enter its lower arousal states. Pre-sleep cognitive arousal, the sustained mental activity of the nighttime loop, elevates metabolic activity in the brain, generating heat that interferes with this transition. Studies measuring core body temperature in people who report high pre-sleep rumination find that the thermoregulatory shift is delayed and reduced. The body that should be cooling is warming instead, not dramatically, but enough to push sleep onset measurably further into the night. The loop is not only keeping the mind awake, it is keeping the body too warm to sleep. What the inner voice produces at night is not only a psychological event, it is, in measurable biological terms, an inflammatory one. Research examining the relationship between psychological stress and Immune function has found that sustained cognitive and emotional arousal elevates the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines, signaling molecules that are part of the immune system's response to threat. Among them is interleukin-6, a cytokine associated with systemic inflammation that has been detected at elevated levels in people following periods of high psychological stress, including stress generated by rumination alone without any physical stressor present. The implication, carefully stated because the research is ongoing, is that the body treats the sustained activation of the threat response system even when that activation is driven entirely by thought as a physiological event requiring an immune response. The mind generating a loop at 2 a.m. is doing something the body registers as a form of injury. Language running long enough in distress leaves a biological trace. The jaw deserves attention here, not as metaphor, but as anatomy. The masseter and temporalis muscles, which control jaw closure, are among the first muscles in the body to respond to psychological stress and among the most persistent in holding that response. During mental rehearsal of interpersonal conflict, the imagined confrontation, the argument being run for the third time through the inner voice, the motor cortex activates the same muscle programs it would activate if the confrontation were physically occurring. The jaw clenches, not fully in most cases, not consciously, but the tension accumulates through the hours of the loop, and by morning, the physical record of the night's cognitive activity is sometimes readable in the face. A soreness at the temples, a tenderness along the jaw, an ache in the muscles that were bracing all night for something that was only ever happening in the mind. The face holds the shape of what the mind was carrying. There is a direction this can also run. The relationship between the inner voice and the autonomic nervous system is not one way. If rapid, fragmented, emotionally charged inner speech activates the sympathetic system, then slow, deliberate, even-paced inner speech can activate the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest counterpart to fight or flight that produces calm, reduces heart rate, and permits the physiological descent toward sleep. This is not a theoretical claim. Research in psychophysiology finds that the pace and quality of inner speech, not just its content, but its rhythm, its spaciousness, the deliberate extension of the time between one thought and the next, produces measurable shifts in heart rate variability, a reliable indicator of parasympathetic activity. The body is listening to the voice's speed as much as its words. A voice that slows down takes the body with it. The pace of the thought is a physiological instruction. When the nighttime loop is primarily visual, when the mind is not so much narrating as picturing, running the feared scenario as a sequence of images rather than as a stream of language, the visual cortex activates. Not fully, not at the level of actual visual perception, but measurably the neural tissue responsible for processing what the eyes see becomes partially active in response to what the mind constructs in their absence. Imagery-based Rumination recruits the visual system, the spatial processing systems, sometimes the motor system if the imagined scene involves physical action. The brain watching a feared scenario is not simply thinking about it in a disembodied way. It is, in the most literal, neurological sense, partially watching it, running a low-resolution version of the visual experience in the absence of any external visual input. The mind sees what it imagines, not fully, but enough to register what accumulates across months and years of chronic nighttime. Overthinking is eventually legible in the resting body, not only during active rumination episodes, but between them. Research comparing cardiovascular profiles across groups differentiated by rumination tendency finds that chronic overthinkers show elevated resting heart rate and reduced heart rate variability even during periods of rest and distraction when no active stress is present and no obvious loop is running. The body that has spent hundreds of nights in sympathetic activation has adjusted its resting baseline upward, recalibrated toward a state of low-level readiness that was once reserved for moments of genuine urgency. The physiological signature of the night loop does not entirely clear when the night ends. Something of it remains set into the body's default operating level, waiting for the next night to resume where the last one left. The body keeps the score of what the mind rehearsed in the dark. There is one more consequence worth following, one that reaches further into the body than the nervous system, the immune response, or the sleep-disrupted cardiovascular baseline. The gut, the enteric nervous system, the dense network of neurons lining the gastrointestinal tract, communicates bidirectionally with the brain along the vagus nerve, and it is sensitive in ways that researchers are still fully mapping to the autonomic state of the system it is connected to. Pre-sleep cognitive arousal, the sustained sympathetic activation of the nighttime loop, disrupts gastrointestinal motility, the rhythmic, coordinated muscular activity that moves material through the digestive tract. In people who ruminate significantly before sleep, disruption to this motility is measurable and consistent. The gut is not a passive system waiting for the mind to settle. It is part of the same arousal loop, influenced by the same sympathetic activation, responding to the same language-generated stress signals, registering in its own neurological vocabulary what the inner voice is saying. Upstairs in the dark, the thought running at 2 a.m. is a whole-body event. And then, even when the loop finally stills, even when the voice runs out of material or exhaustion finally pulls consciousness toward sleep, the body does not immediately return to its baseline. The physiological signature of sustained cognitive arousal lingers. Heart rate remains elevated for a measurable interval after active rumination ceases. Cortisol levels do not drop immediately with the cessation of thought. The muscles that were bracing remain partially contracted for some time after the scenario they were bracing for has stopped being generated. The body retains the shape of what the mind was doing, holding it briefly but verifiably past the moment the mind moved on. The echo of the loop outlasts the loop itself. Not everyone's night sounds the same. This is worth saying plainly because the experience of the nighttime loop can feel so total, so universal in its texture, that it becomes easy to assume everyone inside a dark room at 2 a.m. is having roughly the same interior experience, the same verbal spiral, the same replaying quality, the same voice running over the same kind of material. But the inner life at night varies in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes profound. There are people whose nights sound almost nothing like the experience described in the previous hours of this narration, and understanding why is not a detour from the subject. It is the subject seen from a different and clarifying angle. The night reveals how differently minds are built. Begin with something that challenges the most basic assumption most people carry about their own inner experience. A small but carefully documented portion of the population, researchers working in the tradition of Russell Hurlburt estimate somewhere between 5 and 10%, though the true figure remains uncertain because the phenomenon is underreported and poorly understood, describe having no verbal inner voice at all. Not a quieter one, not one that surfaces only occasionally, but a genuine absence of the internal verbal monologue that most people take to be a fundamental feature of consciousness. This condition has been named an endophasia, and people who experience it do not report an absence of thought. They report thought that is structured differently through images, spatial relationships, emotional impressions, abstract knowing that carries no linguistic form. Their nighttime experience, when the mind is restless and unresolved material surfaces, is organized around an entirely different cognitive architecture. What keeps them awake is not a voice. It is something harder to name, and, for that reason, sometimes harder to notice and interrupt. The inner voice is not the universal instrument of mind it appears to be. Among people who do have a robust verbal inner voice, the question of who overthinks most at night is not randomly distributed. Research examining sex differences in rumination finds consistent patterns. Women report higher rates of nighttime rumination than men across multiple studies and cultural contexts. The explanation for this difference is not settled, and it almost certainly involves several overlapping factors. One that researchers return to repeatedly is the role of socialized self-monitoring, the degree to which cultural conditioning has trained an individual to continuously track their own presentation, anticipate the responses of others, and evaluate their social performance against internalized standards. Self-monitoring of this kind is a direct feeder of the nighttime loop. It produces exactly the kind of unresolved social material. Did I say that right? Did they take it the wrong way? What did that expression mean? That the default mode network returns to when external demands lift. The socialization of self-monitoring is not the only contributing factor, but it is one with documented relevance to the sex difference in nighttime rumination frequency. What we are trained to watch in ourselves follows us into the dark. There is a dimension of individual difference that sits at the intersection of neurology and personality, one that shapes how intensely the night inner voice runs, how much sensory and emotional information it processes, how long it takes to reach the threshold of overwhelm in the presence of unresolved material. Researchers studying sensory processing sensitivity, the trait associated with what is sometimes called the highly sensitive person, find that individuals with this trait show measurably more intense central nervous system processing of incoming stimuli, both sensory and emotional. Their nervous systems do not simply register more. They process more deeply, hold more, and take longer to complete that processing. At night, when the day's accumulated sensory and emotional material finally arrives without competition, this depth of processing does not switch off, continues sometimes for hours, working through what the day contained with a thoroughness that the less sensitive nervous system completes more quickly or defers more easily. The intense nighttime inner voice of a highly sensitive person is not a symptom. It is the same depth of processing that runs during the day, operating in the conditions that reveal most clearly what it costs. The depth of the night experience is proportional to the depth of the day's processing. The relationship between introversion and nighttime rumination is not simply a matter of personality type producing predictable tendencies. It reflects something more structural about the direction in which different nervous systems preferentially process experience. Introverts, broadly defined, are characterized by a processing bias toward internal rather than external input. They derive more of their cognitive and emotional data from internal states, memories, and self-generated simulations than from the social and sensory environment. This internal processing bias does not rest when the day ends. It carries directly into the preparation for sleep, and in the absence of external input, an internal processing system with no competing direction runs more material more deeply for longer. Research examining pre-sleep thought patterns across introversion and extroversion finds that introverts report significantly more elaborate nighttime inner narratives, longer pre-sleep thought sequences, and higher difficulty disengaging from internal processing in favor of the physiological quietude that sleep requires. The introvert's night is longer on the inside than it appears on the outside. Circadian biology adds another layer to the variation in who suffers most and when. Every person carries an internal biological clock with a genetically influenced phase preference, a chronotype that determines the natural timing of their alertness, their cortisol rhythms, their sleep pressure accumulation. Night owls, people whose chronotype places their natural sleep-wake phase several hours later than social convention typically accommodates, face a specific and documented amplification of nighttime rumination that has less to do with their personality than with a mismatch between their biology and their schedule. When a late-phase chronotype attempts to sleep At a socially conventional hour, the brain is not yet in the physiological state that permits easy sleep onset. The default mode network is still in its active phase. The prefrontal inhibitory systems that would otherwise help quiet the inner voice have not yet reached the mild suppression that precedes natural sleep. The result is a person lying in the dark with a brain that is, by its own biological timing, not yet ready for what they are asking it to do, and a default mode network that, in that state of enforced but premature rest, runs the nighttime loop with particular force. The night owl's worst hours are often the ones society assigns as bedtime. Among the most significant sources of individual variation in nighttime thought is the presence of trauma history, not because trauma produces a categorically different kind of inner voice, but because it reorganizes the architecture of what the voice returns to and how it returns there. Trauma-related intrusive cognitions at night operate through different mechanisms than ordinary rumination. They are more likely to arrive as involuntary intrusions than as deliberate retrieval, more likely to carry sensory and somatic content rather than purely linguistic content, and more likely to resist the kind of deliberate cognitive redirection that can interrupt an ordinary rumination loop. Research in trauma and memory finds that traumatic memories are stored with different characteristics than ordinary episodic memories. More fragmented, less temporally organized, more easily triggered by partial sensory cues, and these characteristics shape the quality of the nighttime experience they produce. The person whose nights carry the content of past trauma is not simply ruminating more intensely. They are navigating a different kind of relationship between memory and the present moment entirely. Trauma changes not just what the night holds, but how the night holds it. There are people whose pre-sleep transition moves not through language, but through image, who, as wakefulness loosens and the mind begins its descent, enter a state organized around visual and spatial experience rather than inner verbal narration. For these individuals, the hypnagogic transition is rich with generated imagery, landscapes, faces, abstract forms, scenes that have no clear referent in memory, but arrive with the quality of perception. Researchers studying individual differences in mental imagery vividness find a population of people with exceptionally high imagery capacity, sometimes called hyperphantasia, for whom this visual mode of pre-sleep processing is dominant. Their nighttime experience of unresolved material is more likely to arrive as a recurring image than as a recurring sentence. The quality of what keeps them awake is pictorial rather than verbal, which means the strategies most commonly offered for interrupting nighttime rumination, nearly all of which address the verbal inner voice, may not reach the mechanism actually running in them. Not every night loop speaks in words. The capacity to disengage from a thought loop, to recognize the loop for what it is and redirect cognitive resources elsewhere, is not evenly distributed across individuals, and the variable that predicts it most reliably is not willpower or emotional resilience or any quality most people would think to name. It is working memory capacity. Working memory, the cognitive system responsible for holding and manipulating information in active awareness, functions as the primary buffer between an intrusive thought arriving and that thought, establishing dominance over the attentional field. A robust working memory can hold the arriving thought at a slight distance while simultaneously generating competing cognitive content. A counter narrative, a redirection, an alternative frame. When working memory capacity is lower, this buffering is less effective. The intrusive thought arrives and fills the available space more completely, leaving less room for the processes that would contest it. This is why the nighttime loop is harder to exit when the person is already cognitively depleted. Exhaustion reduces working memory capacity, and reduced working memory capacity reduces the primary cognitive tool for interrupting the loop. Fatigue doesn't just fail to stop the loop. It removes the main thing that could. Among the more quietly complex variations in the nighttime inner experience is the one that occurs in people who have difficulty identifying and naming their own emotional states, a trait measured on a dimension researchers call alexithymia. People high in alexithymia are not without emotion. They experience strong feeling. But the linguistic and cognitive systems that would normally translate that feeling into nameable, communicable form are less accessible to them. Their inner emotional experience is less verbal, less categorized, and harder to resolve through the kind of narrative processing that language-based rumination, for all its costs, at least attempts. Night, in the presence of unresolved emotional material, their inner voice may run loops that are strikingly more abstract and less specifically emotional than those of people with higher emotional literacy, circling a feeling they cannot quite name in language that cannot quite reach what is driving it. The loop runs, but the content it is trying to address remains partially inaccessible to the very system the loop is using to address it. The mind circles what it cannot yet say. The last and perhaps deepest source of individual variation in the nighttime inner voice is one that was established long before the person lying awake in the dark had any conscious experience at all. Attachment theory, the framework developed by John Bowlby and extended by decades of subsequent research, holds that the quality of early caregiving relationships shapes the developing nervous system's expectations about safety, threat, and the reliability of connection. These expectations, established in infancy and early childhood, do not remain as explicit memories or conscious beliefs. They become the operating assumptions of the autonomic nervous system, the background level of vigilance the body maintains, the ease or difficulty with which the threat detection system settles in conditions of safety, the degree to which solitude feels neutral or charged. Research linking adult attachment style to sleep quality and pre-sleep cognition finds consistent patterns. Insecure attachment, whether anxious or avoidant, is associated with higher nighttime cognitive arousal more frequent and more intense pre-sleep rumination, and greater difficulty achieving the physiological quietude that sleep onset requires. The night loop in many people is not simply a response to current events. It is the echo of a much older learning about whether the dark is safe. The child who learned to stay alert is still sometimes the one keeping the adult awake. There is something the night occasionally leaves behind. Not always, not reliably enough to make the loop feel worth it in the hours when it is running, but with a frequency that researchers have documented carefully enough to take seriously. Something arrives at the door of morning that was not there the night before. Solution that wasn't available at midnight is somehow present at 7. A perspective that the loop kept obscuring has, by some process that didn't announce itself, quietly reorganized. An insight that no amount of deliberate thinking produced during the day appears, fully formed in the first few minutes of wakefulness, as if delivered by a process that had been running without supervision, while the conscious mind was somewhere else entirely. The night that costs something sometimes also produces something. At the threshold of sleep, in the hypnagogic state where wakefulness loosens without fully releasing, the brain enters a condition of associative freedom that has no precise equivalent during ordinary waking cognition. The executive systems that govern deliberate, goal-directed thought relax their hold. The inhibitory processes that ordinarily prevent unrelated concepts from colliding in active awareness weaken. What remains is a kind of cognitive weather, images arriving without narrative logic, ideas making contact with other ideas that would never have been placed in proximity by conscious reasoning, fragments of the day's unresolved material drifting into unexpected arrangements. Some of the most documented creative breakthroughs in scientific and artistic history have been traced to this exact state, the moment between waking and sleep when the mind generates connections it is normally too organized to make. Thomas Edison, who understood this state with practical precision, reportedly napped in a chair holding steel balls in his hands so that the moment he drifted into hypnagogia and his grip relaxed, the noise of the balls hitting the floor would wake him, giving him access to whatever the threshold had produced before it dissolved back into ordinary consciousness. The edge of sleep is one of the mind's most generative addresses. The same default mode network that runs the nighttime loop, the self-referential, memory-integrating, future-simulating circuit that activates in the absence of focused external attention, is also the network most associated with creative insight and spontaneous problem-solving. Research in cognitive neuroscience has found that the incubation effect, the well-documented phenomenon in which a problem that resists conscious solution yields to insight after a period of rest or distraction, is mediated largely by default mode activity. When deliberate, problem-solving is suspended and the default mode runs freely, it continues working on unresolved material through a process of broad associative search that conscious, focused thought cannot replicate. The same network that makes the night difficult is also the one conducting background research on problems the day couldn't finish. These are not two separate networks with opposing functions. They are the same network in the same conditions, producing different outputs depending on what material it is given and how the emotional load around that material is configured. The machinery of overthinking and the machinery of insight share the same address in the brain. Sleep itself carries a problem-solving function that goes beyond simple consolidation. Research on the relationship between sleep and creative cognition, including work published in journals, including Nature and Psychological Science, finds that certain kinds of insight problems are solved more frequently by people who have slept between their first encounter with the problem and their second attempt at it than by people who remained awake across the same interval. The effect is particularly strong for problems that require a restructuring of the original problem frame, seeing the problem differently, not just working harder at the existing approach. REM sleep appears to be especially implicated in this restructuring capacity, the same neural environment that loosens the emotional charge of difficult memories also loosens the structural assumptions around difficult problems, permitting the kind of reorganization that feels, upon waking, like sudden clarity. The person who lay awake overthinking a problem and then finally slept may not have wasted the night. The night may have been working on the problem in a different register than the loop. What the conscious mind could not solve, the sleeping mind occasionally does. Not all of what the night produces through its restless processing is insight in the conventional sense. Some of it is something quieter and more personal, meaning-making, the gradual conversion of raw experience into narrative, of things that happened into things that can be understood and integrated into the ongoing story of a life. The psychologist Jonathan Haidt and others working in the field of post-traumatic growth have documented the process by which difficult experiences are transformed over time into elements of a coherent personal narrative, a process that requires sustained engagement with the experience's emotional content, not avoidance of it. Nighttime rumination, which maintains emotional contact with unresolved material long past the point of comfort, may in some cases be performing precisely this function, not efficiently, not comfortably, but genuinely. The loop that will not put down a difficult event may be the mind refusing to file it before it has been made sense of. The cost of that refusal is real. So sometimes is its eventual product. Some loops are, in their way, a form of loyalty to what happened. There is a practice so simple it seems insufficient for what it actually does. In a series of studies conducted by the psychologist James Pennebaker over several decades, people who wrote about emotionally significant experiences freely, privately, without editing for audience or outcome, showed measurable reductions in intrusive thought frequency about those experiences in subsequent weeks. the act of translating internal experience into external. Language appears to do something to the loop that internal language alone cannot. It provides a form of closure that the circling inner voice, returning endlessly to the same material, is structurally unable to generate for itself. Writing externalizes the loop. It places the material outside the mind in a form that the mind can then perceive as recorded, as having been received, held, and no longer requiring the internal repetition that was, in part, a kind of insistence on not being forgotten. For nighttime ruminators, Pennebaker's finding suggests something practical and strange. The most effective intervention for the loop may be to give it a surface to land on. The loop runs longest when it has nowhere to put what it is carrying. One of the reasons the night's reduced executive control is not only a liability is that executive control is also, in certain contexts, a constraint on creative cognition. The prefrontal cortex that weakens in the late-night hours is the same structure that enforces the logical and associative rules governing ordinary waking thought, the rules that prevent distant concepts from making contact, that maintain the coherence of an ongoing line of reasoning by suppressing distracting tangents, that hold the mind on a single track. In the creative context, these are not always features. A mind less governed by executive constraint is a mind more capable of the kind of far-reaching associative search that produces genuinely novel combinations, connections between ideas that were previously held apart by the ordinary logic of focused thought. Some of what arrives in the late-night mind as rambling, associative, apparently purposeless mental wandering is, in its deep structure, the most genuinely exploratory cognitive mode available to the human brain. The night loosens the rules, and some of what becomes possible in that loosening has value that the rule-governed day would not have generated. The mind at its least controlled is sometimes at its most creative. There is also a measurable difference in the quality of inner speech between the anxious nighttime loop and the kind of generative nighttime thinking that occasionally precedes insight. Researchers examining the phenomenology of creative versus anxious rumination find that the inner voice in creative states tends to be more metaphorical, more imagistic, more willing to leave a thought incomplete and allow the next one to arrive before the previous one has resolved. Anxious rumination, by contrast, is more literal, more repetitive, more insistent on reaching a conclusion before the next thought is admitted. The creative night voice is porous. The anxious night voice is tight. This distinction suggests that the quality of overthinking, not just its presence or absence, shapes what it produces. The same broadly active default mode, running across the same dark hours, generates very different outputs depending on whether the emotional environment permits openness or demands resolution. The difference between the loop that exhausts and the loop that occasionally illuminates may be measured in the tightness of its grip. Among the more counterintuitive findings in the science of sleep and memory is this the material a person deliberately thinks about in the period immediately before sleep is disproportionately represented in the memory consolidation that occurs during that night's sleep. The brain does not consolidate the day's experience with democratic even-handedness, giving equal processing weight to everything that occurred. It prioritizes material that was emotionally significant, and it also prioritizes material that was most recently active in working memory, material that was being turned over, attended to, engaged with in the minutes before sleep onset. Research examining targeted memory reactivation and pre-sleep rehearsal finds that intentional pre-sleep review of material, a skill, a language, a problem, a relationship, increases the likelihood and depth of that material's overnight consolidation. The nighttime loop, which keeps certain material active at high intensity right up to the edge of sleep, may be inadvertently performing this function for the experiences it cannot release. What the loop rehearses longest before sleep is what sleep most thoroughly processes. The mind consolidates what it could not put down. That processing, when it works, when the loop has maintained contact with difficult material and sleep has run its emotional and associative work on it, can produce something that functions like cognitive restructuring, a shift in the relationship between the self and the difficult event that was not consciously engineered, that arrived without deliberate effort, and that feels less like a conclusion reached than like a perspective that was simply there upon waking, where a different and more painful perspective had been the night before. Cognitive behavioral therapy attempts to produce this kind of restructuring through deliberate guided work. The night occasionally produces a version of it spontaneously, not reliably, not for everyone, not without cost, but genuinely. The morning that carries a lightness the previous night did not seem to permit is not always an accident. Sometimes it is the outcome of a process that ran all night in a register the conscious mind never had access to, doing in the dark and without language something that language had been trying and failing to do for hours. The night works on what we cannot work on ourselves. And then there is the account that is hardest to quantify, but that emerges clearly enough in the research on meaning-making and post-adversity growth to deserve plain acknowledgement. People who have navigated the long experience of chronic nighttime overthinking, who have spent months or years inside the loop and eventually found some relationship with it, often describe arriving at a quality of self-knowledge that they locate, in retrospect, partly inside those difficult nights, not because the nights were good or necessary or worth what they cost, but because the sustained and inescapable contact with one's own unresolved material, with the places where identity feels unfinished and the self-concept uncertain, eventually produces a familiarity with the interior that people who never had cause to look so closely do not quite have. The person who has spent hundreds of nights inside their own loop knows the architecture of their inner experience with a specificity that has its own quiet usefulness, knows what the voice returns to, knows what it cannot release, knows the emotional logic of their own unfinished business in a way that is, in the end, a form of knowledge. It is not the knowledge anyone would choose to come by in this way, but it is knowledge nonetheless. There is something happening right now that has no real parallel anywhere else in the known universe. A mind is observing itself, not performing a task, not responding to an external demand, not solving a problem that arrived from outside, but turning its attention back along the very axis of its own awareness, watching its own watching, thinking about its own thinking, aware of being aware. This is so ordinary to the human experience that it barely registers as remarkable. But it is remarkable. It may be the most remarkable thing that exists. And the night, with all its difficulty, its loops, its relentless inner speech, its refusal to simply stop, is the condition in which this capacity reveals itself most completely. The person, lying awake in the dark, noticing that they are thinking about what they thought earlier, noticing that they have now noticed this, and noticing that too is doing something that took the universe billions of years to produce. The overthinking night is, among other things, the mind becoming visible to itself. Metacognition, the capacity to think about one's own thinking, to monitor cognitive processes as they occur, to evaluate the quality and accuracy and direction of one's own mental activity, is present in its basic forms in several animal species. But in humans it reaches a depth and elaboration that appears to be genuinely unique, and it operates most intensely not during focused external engagement, but during the kind of internally directed, self-referential state that the night reliably produces. When the day's tasks fall away and the mind is left alone with itself, metacognitive activity, the inner observation of the inner experience, increases. The person watching the loop is practicing, whether they intend to or not, one of the most sophisticated cognitive operations the human brain performs. The discomfort of doing it does not diminish what it is. Watching the loop is an act of metacognition. That is not a small thing. What is watching exactly when the mind observes itself? This question sits at the intersection of neuroscience and philosophy, and has not been fully resolved in either domain, but the neurological evidence is suggestive. The system that generates the loop, the default mode network, the self-referential circuit running its emotional rehearsals, is distinct in its neural substrate from the system that observes the loop. The observing function, what researchers sometimes call the witnessing self or the metacognitive monitor, recruits lateral, prefrontal and parietal regions that are not the same regions, generating the thought content being observed. Two systems. One night, the voice that spirals and the voice that notices. The spiral are not the same voice even when they feel like one. The watcher is not the same as the watched, and the fact that this distinction can be felt from the inside, that there is a recognizable difference between being inside the loop and standing at its edge observing it, is one of the most Practically significant things neuroscience has quietly confirmed about the architecture of self-awareness. You are not only the loop, you are also the one who can see it. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, in his work on the nature of consciousness, proposed what he called the multiple drafts model. The view that consciousness is not a single, unified stream, arriving at a central point of awareness, but a set of parallel, competing processes, each generating its own version of events, with what we experience as a unified conscious moment being the result of a kind of ongoing editorial negotiation between them. The nighttime overthinking experience, in its most honest phenomenology, bears a strong resemblance to this description. The loop is not one voice. It is several overlapping, each pushing its own version of what happened and what it means, and what the person lying in the dark experiences as their own. Thought is already the output of a process of selection and integration that occurred below the threshold of awareness. What rises to the surface of consciousness at 2 a.m. is the draft, that one temporarily among several competing versions. There are others running beneath it that were not selected. Consciousness, in this view, is less a window onto the mind's activity than a summary of it, and the summary is always partial. The thought you are aware of is not all the thinking that is happening beneath the loop and through it, and sometimes despite it. The sense of a continuous self persists. The feeling that the person who lay down tonight is the same person who was sitting at a table this morning, who was a child who learned to read, in a classroom whose smell they can still almost recall, who will wake tomorrow carrying the same name and the same unfinished business. This continuity is one of the mind's most quietly persistent productions, and it is in significant part a production of the inner voice, the narrative self, the story of who one is, held together across time, is actively maintained by inner speech, rehearsed, revised, and sustained through the ongoing process of self-referential thought that the night accelerates. The person whose inner voice runs through the dark is not suffering an interruption of their sense of self. They are, in the most direct possible sense, constructing it, the loop that feels like a departure from peace is simultaneously a continuation of the deepest ongoing project the mind undertakes, the project of remaining a coherent someone across time. The night loop is, among other things, identity keeping itself intact. Dreams continue what the waking mind began. The emotional content that was active in pre-sleep rumination, the unresolved conflict, the rehearsed conversation, the feared scenario, pictured in detail at the edge of sleep, does not disappear. When consciousness transitions into dreaming, research examining the relationship between pre-sleep thought content and dream content finds significant continuity. The emotional themes present in nighttime rumination reappear, transformed and recombined in the dreams that follow. This is not coincidence. It reflects the brain's continuity of purpose across the sleep-wake boundary. The emotional material flagged as unresolved Before sleep is the material the dreaming brain continues to work on through the night. The dream is not a departure from the loop. It is the loop released from the constraints of language and logic running on in the associative imagistic medium that the dreaming brain provides. The night is one long cognitive arc, waking rumination and dreaming imagination, as consecutive movements in the same ongoing process of emotional reckoning. The loop does not stop when sleep arrives, changes form. The inner voice that runs through the night did not originate in solitude. This is one of the stranger truths about the most private of all human experiences. The voice that speaks to you alone in the dark is not originally yours. It is internalized. Dialogue, the gradual absorption across years of childhood, development of the voices, patterns, rhythms, and evaluative tones of the people who raised and surrounded the child who became you. The developmental psychologist Lev Vygotsky, whose work on the social origins of inner speech remains foundational to the field, documented the process by which external speech conversation between a child and a caregiver is gradually taken inward, transformed over years from spoken exchange into the private verbal thought that eventually runs without a visible interlocutor. The inner voice is not a spontaneous personal invention. It is a relationship that became internal. The voice you argue with at 3 a.m., the one delivering the verdict on the day's performance, the one that generates the other side of the conversation you keep rehearsing. It was built from the outside, assembled from the speech of people who spoke to you before you had the language to understand what was being made. The most private voice you own was built from other people's words. Silence, true cognitive quiet, the actual cessation of inner speech is sufficiently rare in the human experience that most people are measurably uncomfortable when it arrives. Research building on earlier work by Timothy Wilson and colleagues finds that a significant portion of people, when placed alone in a room with nothing to do and nothing to engage with, find the experience genuinely unpleasant within minutes, and that the discomfort is not simply boredom but something closer to the distress that accompanies an absence. The mind was not prepared for. The inner voice, it appears, is not simply one activity among others that the mind can put down at will. It is closer to a continuous function, one so interwoven with the baseline experience of being conscious that its absence registers as unusual, even threatening. The person lying awake in the dark, frustrated by the loop that will not stop, is experiencing one expression of a mind whose default condition is activity. The alternative, the genuinely quiet mind, is not a natural resting state. It is an achievement, and for most people it is a rare one. Silence is not where the mind begins. It is somewhere the mind occasionally manages to arrive. The restlessness of the human mind at night, its refusal to simply stop when the body stops, its generation of thought in the absence of any external input requiring it. is sometimes framed as a malfunction and evolutionary. Overshoot, a capacity for self-reflection that exceeded its adaptive purpose and turned back on itself. But there is a different framing available, and the evidence for it is not negligible. A mind that continues processing in the absence of external demand is a mind that can prepare for futures that have not yet arrived, learn from events that have already passed, maintain the coherence of a self-concept across time, and navigate the extraordinary complexity of human social life by running simulations in the quiet hours when social life itself has temporarily withdrawn. The overthinking night may be the cost of precisely the cognitive capacities that make extended human social cooperation, long-term planning, creative problem-solving, and the construction of meaning possible. The same restlessness that makes sleep difficult also makes civilization possible. These are not two separate tendencies. They are one tendency experienced in two very different conditions. The mind that cannot stop at night is the same mind that built everything the morning holds. What the loop is ultimately reaching for across all the replaying, the anticipating, the self-evaluating, the counterfactual imagining, the long construction of what should have been said is something that narrative psychologists call closure, the conversion of an experience into a story that has been told, absorbed, and completed. The human mind is, at its deepest organizational level, a narrative-seeking system. It does not file experiences as raw data. It constructs accounts of them, sequences, with causes, meanings, implications, and some form of resolution that allows them to be placed in the past tense and left there. When an experience resists this conversion, when it remains too emotionally charged, too ambiguous, too unresolved in its implications, the narrative system keeps returning to it, attempting again and again to reach the ending that would allow it to become a story that is finished rather than one that is still happening. The nighttime loop is not irrational. It is the narrative system doing exactly what it was built to do in conditions: darkness, stillness, the withdrawal of competing demands that happen to reveal most clearly how much unfinished material it is still carrying. Overthinking is the mind trying to finish the story of the day. And then there is the last fact, not the most dramatic, not the largest in scope or the most recently discovered, but the one that, in the long dark of a night spent inside a loop, may be the most worth holding. The fact that you can notice the loop is not a given. It is not a feature present at birth, not a capacity that every mind develops to the same degree, not something that can be assumed across the full range of conscious experience. The ability to stand at a slight distance from your own thinking, to observe the spiral as a spiral, to recognize the loop as a loop, to see the inner critic as a system rather than an authority, is a metacognitive achievement that required the development of a prefrontal architecture, a sufficient density of self-referential processing, and years of accumulated inner experience to produce. It is, when measured against the vast span of life on this planet and the extraordinary rarity of minds, complex enough to perform it among the rarest things. In nature, the person lying awake at 3 a.m., watching their own thoughts circle, aware that the circle is a circle, that person is doing something that almost nothing else in the history of the universe has ever been able to do. The discomfort of the loop is real. The cost is real. But so is what is quietly present in the noticing. A mind aware of itself in the dark, still here, still watching, still against everything. The night has tried, unable to disappear entirely into what it thinks. The loop runs, and somewhere above it something watches, and that watching is not nothing. That watching is, in fact, everything. If any of this stayed with you tonight, like and subscribe.